Hello folks, welcome back to another feedback video, this time for the Germany Paper 3 mock exam. Remember, as well as towards your revision for your real exams in the summer, this video will be useful for a reminder of a walkthrough on how to do Paper 3 as well. Initially though, let's get onto it, focusing on feedback for your recent mock exam. As always, it will work better if you have your papers in front of you, so you can have a look at what you wrote and what you should have wrote. And maybe also spot some of the mistakes that you might have made. Again, always reflecting on technique, how to do each question, and the content in which you need to put in each question. Alright, so this Germany paper is obviously the most important, it's worth the most, it's also the paper that we can get the most of our marks on, because most of it is a script, so make sure that you fully understand how to do this paper, and then hopefully the content will just deal with itself. Alright, and as with all the other videos, they're going to be quite long, so break them down, maybe just do one question at a time, or if they're small questions, just do one or two together, but don't be spending more than half an hour on this before you have a break, and then come back to it later on with your fresh eyes and obviously your paper as well. Okay, so let's start then thinking about what this video will be focused on. So in your mock exam, this paper is going to look at the early NSDAP, the Nazi Party, and how it developed. It's going to have two 12 markers to think about: the rise of Hitler to Chancellor and the economic miracle, or whether they reduced unemployment, and the whole of section B will be on the Hitler Youth. So there's 36 marks available for section B, as we'll talk about in this video, and as you know, we really need to make sure that we get the maximum amount of time on section B. Unlike the other papers though, would we not recommend that you go backwards and do the big questions first. For section B, certainly you need to have done all the questions in the lead up to it in order you to do the big essay. So we'll talk about that when we get to section B, but there's a lot to do in this paper and you haven't got a long time to do it. You've got an hour and a half, so we need to make sure that our time management is on point. Absolutely critical we give the big question the most amount of time. So some general feedback, and with that in mind, you can see on the screen now a breakdown of the times that you might want to spend for each question. These are not set in stone, but rough guides, you should be okay if you're spending about that kind of time on it. So the inference question 1, 5 minutes maximum for both. They include them both. The 12 marker, about 25 minutes, a little bit longer. Now you've got an extension on this paper than previous years, and maybe 20 minutes on the source question, and then 5 minutes and 7 minutes on the view of the interpretations, and then of course 30 minutes at least on the big essay question at the end. Okay, as always, make sure that your answers include the words of the question in the opening line, especially for the essays. It just helps to keep you focused and make sure you don't go off on one and maybe create your own questions. Alright, you will lose marks even if you write brilliant things. If it's not focused on their question, then you're going to lose some marks. So the inference question was generally okay. Some good inferences made. Some we had to think about a little bit, but in the end we think, okay, that's fair enough. Just try and make it as clear to the examiner as you can. Don't try and be too clever about it. And make sure you're not just pointing out what the source literally says. That's not an inference, is it? That's a source observation, really. You're picking out some content, and that's not what you're asked to do. An inference is more of a feeling that you get when you read a source. All right, we'll talk about some of those in a minute with some model answers. The 12 markers still need a little bit of work, similar to the Elizabeth mock. Remember, you do not need an introduction or a conclusion for the 12 markers. You do need loads and loads of facts to help explain in whichever one you pick, either was why Hitler became Chancellor or why unemployment was reduced. Make sure your facts that you're using actually answers those questions, not just leaving it implied to the examiner to try and work out what you mean. Be really, really clear. Assume the examiner doesn't know anything. Alright, and then section B, the bit that's the most important in the whole paper, as it's worth the most and is mostly the script, was done generally really, really well. Very, very pleased with this. The source question, though, a little bit ropey in some cases, so we do need to practice that source question, and we need to work on it a little bit more just to make sure that we are not losing some silly marks. But really, generally, the big question was good, and the interpretations, the view of them and why they're different was done really, really well. And as always with every exam, generally feedback is don't leave things blank. If you really are really stuck, just write something about the bullet points or the question. You may not get, or you won't get certainly high marks, but you'll get some marks because you'll definitely talk about something that's correct. Just keep referring back to those bullet points or the question, and those little marks here and there over the whole of your GCSE will pick up some marks, which might be the difference between a grade or two. So don't leave things blank, okay? Alright, so let's start then with the 4 marker. Nice and easy, straight into it is our inference question. We make inferences every day of our lives, don't we? Every day we make an inference about the mood of our teachers, your friends, people at home, all sorts of things. Wearing football kits, we assume they support that team. So we do it all the time, so we should be good at this. The problem that we sometimes have with this inference question is we overthink it and we overcomplicate it, okay? So make sure your inference is directly related to the focus of the question. In this case, the focus of the question is the early development of the NSDAP. So that's all we need to be writing about, nothing else. All right, just make sure that you get that bit right. So let's have a little look at it. You can see on the screen now the source, so source A. Obviously, you'll have a little read of that in the exam. Having done the exam, I don't need to read it again, but just maybe if you want to pause it just so you can read it, get your head in the game a little bit, and then we'll have a look at some model answers. So you do not just repeat what the source says. That's not an inference. Okay, so some of you wrote, I can infer that Rom introduced his army friends to the German Workers' Party because it says Rom introduced his friends to the German Workers' Party. Can you see how that's just literally copying from the source? Now I have put a similar one on as a model answer just to try and show you the subtle difference into that. So you have a little box like this on your page where you fill in the details. You've got nice little sections to make it nice and clear where you do it. So for the first example I want to give you for this, as I have put, the inference is that the NSDAP party grew much quicker than they had expected it to. And then the detail that I've picked out from that is, it says in it, that party membership began to increase so much that we had to move the meetings to much larger venues. And the reason why I think that's an inference is because if they expected to get the crowds they would have done, then they would have obviously booked those meetings in the first place. So the fact that they had to move probably infers to me that they didn't expect it to get so big so quick. Secondly, I can infer the people of Germany like the 25-point programme and the NSDAP policies. And the inference for that, or the detail for that, is that it follows on saying that the party membership grew quickly after presentation of the 25-point programme. So obviously it's because of whatever they saw in that 25-point programme that what they liked and why they thought they'd join the party. So hopefully those two examples make sense. They would definitely get you full marks in this question. But a couple of other examples to think about really, just maybe to show you that there's all sorts of things you could say. So the NSDAP began with just mainly military men. Now can you see that that's not quite the same as the example I've just given you a minute ago, where it says an inference could be that I introduced all my army friends. What we're making the inference here is because Rom is saying that he introduced his army friends to the German Workers' Party, that I am working out there from that the NSDAP began with mainly military men. And I'm not paraphrasing straight from the source for that. That's a subtle one, but I think is a fair inference to make at the beginning, because it kind of says that. Another example, or a final example we could think about on this question, that there were other important people in the party at the beginning. And the detail that made me think that was that Hitler has had to overcome, it says overcome, or defeat his opponents within the party. That would suggest then that he had to get rid of competition. Therefore, other important people in the party. Now we know, don't we, that Anton Drexler was in charge of this party, but because this is an inference question, we require zero knowledge at all, just inferences. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense and you can see how you might get full marks on this paper and this question. Have a look at your answers and see if you got full marks, and if you didn't, see if it makes sense, why not, and of course if not, then just let your teacher know. All right, so you can, as always, the mark scheme does say anything that's relevant can be rewarded, so just make sure that you're not just essentially copying from the source, other than the detail of the source. Obviously you're going to try and pick out that bit, but the inference itself should not have any words from the question. All right, so the 12 marker. This year we have the new part of the exam where you got a choice of 2 12 markers. So as always with these choices, make sure you pick the one you can get the most marks with. And we'll start first with the why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. So again, we're looking for about 25 minutes for this. But this question is huge in lots of ways. Lots of people get quite stressed about this question because they just don't know where to start. But overall, hopefully this feedback video will give you a nice clear overview of the kind of route you might want to take. So you've been offered the bullet points, as always, as the impact of the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the use of propaganda. You must also use information of your own, so that means a third paragraph. I will suggest to you that the third paragraph should be weaknesses of the Weimar Republic, and that's what I've done in the model answer. Some of you are intent on talking about the rebranding of the party after the Munich Putsch. And I feel I've told you in class that I think it's sort of valid, but much more difficult. You know, you've got to know what the Gauleiters and all of those things that happened after the Munich Putsch, and it's really easy to get off focus and start rabbiting on about the Munich Putsch. However, if you want to just really solidify that as an argument, then go and watch the other Germany Rise of Chancellor revision video that is on our YouTube channel. The link will be in the bottom of this video as well, just to give you, again, the organisation of what that paragraph should look like. In this feedback, we're going to just avoid that question, though, and go with the 2 bullet points and the weakness of Weimar as the third. All right, so some issues to think about before we get into this, really, is, and it happened too often, which is surprising, but do not talk about Nazi Germany propaganda. The propaganda in this question is that used to get elected. So the posters, the promises, the aeroplane, the rallies, things like that. Not the propaganda used in Nazi Germany to brainwash the country. Nazification of stadiums, all that stuff, the People's Radio, the cinema, Der Stürmer, architecture, all those things are in Nazi Germany when he's in power and he's trying to brainwash the country into thinking that Nazism is good. This question is asking, how does he become Chancellor? So like in our country, a normal general election where they do normal things to try and persuade the voters to vote for them. Just make sure you don't make that mistake. Otherwise, you could write a really brilliant paragraph on the People's Radio and Der Stürmer, but you will get absolutely no marks. Furthermore to that, I'm not sure why this happened, but it did. Do not talk about terror in Nazi Germany. This is irrelevant to this question. This question is just about how he becomes Chancellor in 1933. Remember, when we refer to Nazi Germany, that's generally after the Night of the Long Knives and the death of Hindenburg and the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act, generally when he's the Führer, the dictator. Everything before that in the rise to Chancellor is legal, remember, is above board. And he decided he was going to do that, remember, with ballot not bullet after the Munich Putsch. Just please be careful, because some of you have written some really good answers about these topics to show you that your revision is working, but for this question, you'll get no marks. And if that happens in your real exam, that will be a real shame. All right. Also, no need to mention the Reichstag fire. This is when he is already Chancellor. Obviously, very quick to be up when he's already Chancellor, but this question is asking how he becomes Chancellor. Do not confuse the Great Depression with hyperinflation in 1923. Many of you, again, have written some brilliant answers about wheelbarrows and getting paid 3 or 4 times a day. All of those things you clearly remember from hyperinflation, but is irrelevant to this question. We're talking about the Great Depression, the 6 million unemployed. So please be careful, okay? These are really great mistakes to make in a mock exam, by the way. But just make sure that you really understand the question before you start writing. Take that time. And then also, similar to that idea about the Munich Putsch being a dangerous topic to go down because you could get very quickly off focus, there's no need to talk about the Treaty of Versailles, the debt, the Munich Putsch, the Cat Putsch, the Spartacus uprising in any great detail in this question. Of course, you can maybe mention them, and I have mentioned them in the model answer you'll see shortly, in the weakness of Weimar Republic, sort of linking to Dolchstoss a little bit, just briefly mentioning that the Weimar Republic, in its brief history, has faced an awful lot of challenges, which is people haven't forgotten, and they're still angry about those things, but that's as far as we want to be going. We do not want to be writing whole paragraphs on the Munich Putsch and the Cat Putsch and things like that. So just be careful, all right? This question is a bit more straightforward than I think some of you have made it. Okay, with that said then, let's have a little look at what we could have said and should have said. For paragraph 1, or reason 1, we'll focus on the Wall Street crash. So the content we want to try and include in this paragraph will be the idea that when the Wall Street crash happened in 1929, America recalled all of its money from every country that owed money. This was particularly damaging for Germany because, remember, everything was based on the Dawes Plan. Stresemann even said himself that Germany was dancing on a volcano, meaning it could erupt at any time. So we want to get that opening of our paragraph in there about how this all started, and then there's a chain of events that go from the Wall Street crash into the Great Depression. So that Dawes Plan money is really holding up Germany. The industrial output, the infrastructure of the country, the factories, everything was being held up by the Dawes Plan money. So without the US money, the German factories went bust. Also, no one in the world can afford to buy anything anyway. So as no one is buying German goods, the economy has just crashed. So a reduction of about 40% of factory workers in this period. So 40%, or half of all the factory workers in Germany are now unemployed. Then the Great Depression follows with 6 million unemployed. That's your sort of golden fact in this story, isn't it? 6 million. Everyone got it right. Nobody forgot it, so well done on that. But these are 6 million angry and desperate people. You can see in the photographs there, people, eating at carcasses of animals, people sleeping on ropes and things because they're homeless, things like that. So we can use that as evidence of this Great Depression and how it all sort of came from the Wall Street crash. In this question, where we are obviously building up to a bit of a point about why he becomes Chancellor, it's the fact that these people are so angry. They are now fed up of the Weimar Republic. They're fed up with the crime, the shanty towns that they're living in. And of course, Hitler is going to take advantage of all this anger and promise to fix it all. And when people are desperate, they often do desperate things. Even if people did have jobs in the Great Depression, their wages fell by 70%, again causing the middle classes and the working classes to be angry. There's obviously a risk here that those, especially the working classes, might go to communism, which we could talk about. Is that there was a slight rise in the communist support, but more often than not, people were more scared of the communists, partly due to the Nazi propaganda as well. So there's loads we can talk about, but we want to get in this essay at least in one paragraph, but certainly all the way through, we can just keep repeating it, that due to the Depression, look at the rise in seats of the Communist Party. They've gone up to 89. It's not a huge jump, but for the Nazi Party, it's massive. They've gone from 12 seats in 1928 to 230 seats. They're by far the biggest party in 1932, and all of that is because of the Great Depression. So you need to somehow get that across in your answer. All right, so with all that said, maybe have a little pause of the video if you want to have a think about those things without me rabbiting on, and then we'll have a look at a model paragraph. Again, these things are not intended to be perfect, but just give you a bit of an idea. So the Wall Street crash and Great Depression, I want to focus on and point out a few bits of the paragraph as we read them to you, but you can of course then stop it and read it yourself without me rabbiting on again. But listen to what I'm saying first before you do that. Open and line, as we keep saying, has to be crystal clear what this paragraph's about. So I'm starting with one reason why Hitler was able to become Chancellor in 1933 was due to the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. So there's our point. This paragraph is going to be all about the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, and I've used the words of the question in my answer. So then we'll go on to start with, in October 1929, the US banks started to recall their loans they had made to German industries and banks in response to the Wall Street crash. Germany's inability to pay back these loans crippled Germany more than most due to how dependent on US money Germany had become. We've just talked about that in our little plan, but we can see how that looks as a sentence in a paragraph. This led to, so a nice little connective there, to German companies and factories collapsing and going bankrupt, therefore resulting in 6 million unemployed citizens. Nice fact, got to be in there, as well as that lovely little fact, about 40% of factory workers by 1932. Even if people did have work, their wages fell by 70%, adding to the anger and the difficulties. So we'll keep loading this paragraph up with reasons why they're going to go to an extreme party. All right. Many people during the Depression found themselves starving and eating animals out of the zoo, as well as sleeping on ropes instead of on the streets. Again, lovely evidence as to what this Depression looked like in reality. The government's inability to deal with the economic crisis meant that the German people found Hitler and the Nazis' promises appealing. At the general election in May 1928, the NSDAP gained only 12 seats. However, in July 1932, the Nazis had won 230 seats, therefore making them the largest party in the Reichstag and allowing him to demand the chancellorship as per the Weimar Constitution. So we're going back to the question there, aren't we, about why this has helped him become chancellor. This level of growth would not have happened, bit of analysis in here for us now, without the Wall Street crash. The economic depression that it caused led to the German people to become disenchanted with the Weimar Republic, looking towards more extremists like Hitler, who presented to them a stronger and more appealing leadership, ultimately leading him to become Chancellor in 1933. So quite a busy paragraph, lots going on in there, very possibly a little bit too much. You may not need to necessarily get all of that in there. Remember, we're looking for 3 strong pieces of evidence, aren't we? But hopefully, just by reading that and listening to what I'm pointing out to you and the technique of it, you can see how that's quite a straightforward paragraph. All right, so when you're ready, we will continue and we'll have a look at paragraph 2. In this case, I'm going to talk about propaganda. And we've talked about the pitfalls and the dangers of getting the propaganda wrong, from Nazi propaganda and election propaganda. Just make sure you don't. Very similarly to the Cold War, in getting your Berlins wrong, Berlin 1 and Berlin 2. These are things that we just have to make sure we fully understand. So some content that you might want to include for your propaganda paragraph is that this election propaganda included promises of a stronger Germany, rebuilding the country, ripping up the Treaty of Versailles, basically all of the things that would appeal to all of the people, and that would make even the most moderate of Germans happy, because they obviously all didn't feel the Treaty of Versailles was particularly fair. So then we want to think about how this propaganda is going to appeal to every part of society: old, young, men, women, farmers, middle classes, and industrialists. The industrialists, which we'll talk about briefly shortly, which is more afraid of communism, so they picked the Nazis instead. That's why they funded the Nazi Party, essentially, because a communist country would obviously take away all their profits, whereas the right-wing Nazi Party said they wouldn't do that. Part of Hitler's propaganda in this election was everything they sort of offered to the public was a bit vague. The policies were a little bit vague. And if the people thought, oh, that's a bit too much, maybe something anti-Semitic, then they just dropped it straight away. So this is a bit like populist politics, where they generally are just saying what people want to hear, really, to get votes. So there's lots to think about there, but we could also think about, if you wanted to, how the SS and the SA, despite being really violent, they are ordered, they are strong, they are regimented, they are everything that the country in the Depression is not. So the main thing that you probably want to include in a propaganda paragraph really is posters. Now, some of you didn't do posters and sort of got yourself all a bit bogged down with various other things. Just go easy. Stick with the easy bit and the posters. You can see the posters on the screen there to the right of the box. Our Last Hope is the sort of grey one there. Arbeit und Brot. All of those promises: work and bread, hope, pride, freedom, aiming at women, all of that. You could say whatever you wanted to, but don't spend hours on it. Just make a few points about some of the posters, what they promised, and then why they appealed to the many, many people in the country, particularly those 6 million unemployed. So big businesses, as we briefly just mentioned, they're going to fund the Nazi Party's campaign. Hitler was able to buy a newspaper, which got him the ability to get his messages across a bit more than if he didn't have a newspaper. And also this Hitler über Deutschland, this plane, such a modern politician in lots of ways. The fact that he was able to fly to up to 5 cities a day really grew his appeal. People felt this guy was something different. And of course, that's what he's going for. That's the propaganda. That's entirely what they're trying to do. But that was funded by the industrialists as well, and the big businesses like Hugo Boss and Bosch. So we're getting to see there's loads to say in this paragraph. You couldn't possibly mention all of this in a paragraph, but this is the kind of stuff that you might. It's only a feedback video, so we're just giving you all the possible things, and then we'll have a look at what that might look like in a paragraph. Another example of propaganda was the rallies. Try not to get themselves confused with the Nazi rallies in Nazi Germany, so Nuremberg. Some of you mentioned that, good knowledge, 200,000 people, but not for this question. The rallies were just used to convey a message to a large audience at once, usually related to the Dolchstoss and how weak the Weimar Republic is, or reminding them of how bad it's been over the last 15, 20 years, particularly the Treaty of Versailles. And then lastly, the promises to return to a more traditionalist country had also a massive appeal, especially to those people who didn't particularly like the Stresemann years, with women getting a bit more freedom and things like that. So the Nazi Party are offering a lot here in this general election, ready to go. All right. Of course, being anti-communist, reminding everyone about the Spartakists and the Russian Revolution, how nasty and how evil communists are. That really helped as well, especially to the businesses, where they're threatening that if the communists get into power, they're going to take all of your wealth. So the farmers as well, the landowners, they were also really concerned that if a communist government came in, they would take control of their land. Well, that was easy enough for them to just switch their side to the Nazis. Bear in mind, they've stopped being bothered about the central parties. The Weimar Republic is essentially on life support right now, and they've fed up. So they go an extreme one way or the other. As we've seen, most jumped to the right. Okay, so how this could look in your paragraph. Again, let's see how we start this thing with technically the opening sentence. We're still getting it wrong despite being told how to do it. So let's just keep seeing it in practice. Another reason why Hitler was able to become Chancellor was because of the NSDAP propaganda. So this paragraph is clearly about propaganda. It goes on to talk a little bit of facts. Joseph Goebbels joined the party in 1924 and was a key to the NSDAP's use of propaganda to increase their appeal. Remember, we're not talking about brainwashing here, we're talking about appeal to get votes. Goebbels and Hitler used various means of propaganda to distribute his radical ideas to a wider audience to gain votes. Posters were used to spread the general message that Hitler would solve the economic and political problems and make Germany an independent and strong country. These posters offered messages such as Arbeit und Brot and hope, which appealed to the many angry and fed up Germans. The offer of work was particularly important for the 6 million unemployed following the Great Depression. So there I'm just linking back to a little bit what I've just said in the first paragraph. Another way the NSDAP used propaganda was to hold massive rallies attacking the Weimar Republic, communism and the Treaty of Versailles, capitalising on the feelings of Dolchstoss. that had been around since the beginning but worsened during this crisis. This was effective as it allowed Hitler to get his message across to large amounts of people at one go. So I've given a little bit of judgment there and a little bit of analysis about the rally example. So we'll be up to finally Hitler, thanks to the support of the industrialists like Hugo Boss and Bosch due to their fear of communism, which was further advanced with this Nazi propaganda, acquired an aeroplane in which he flew up to 5 cities a day. This showed Hitler as a special, new type of leader offering some hope, and he got his messages to more people than other parties, resulting in him getting those 230 seats, and then of course becoming Chancellor. So we're linking back to the question there, and then a little bit of analysis in here. At the end of this little paragraph, I'm going to say arguably the propaganda wouldn't have been as effective if the depression hadn't have happened, meaning people were open-minded to the ideas of the extremist parties. However, Hitler did take full advantage of that little opening with his propaganda and smashed it out of the park, we have to say. Okay, so hopefully that paragraph makes a little bit of sense. Have a look at yours. How was your propaganda paragraph? Did you include some of the things I've mentioned there? Again, possibly there's a little bit too much in my model answer here. In real terms, in real life, in the pressure of an exam, if you could produce this in the time, then absolutely brilliant. You're going to get 12 out of 12 every single time. But remembering we just need to be really tight on our times, really, really disciplined on our times. Say our 3 facts or 3 bits of evidence and explain them, and then move on. Okay, so then the third paragraph, which seems to cause a few problems, we've got all sorts of random things going on. Some Munich Putsch, some early Weimar years, Cat Putsch. Just the weakness of the Weimar Republic is a nice sort of general overall theme. So some of the content that you might want to include in this question would be Brüning's inability to deal with the depression. We want to maybe talk about that. The Chancellor raised taxes, lowered benefits, and reduced wages at a time when they were already on their knees, really, really suffering. That's not a clever thing to do. I believe that Brüning did that out of fully the best intentions in trying to deal with the depression, but it wasn't a good thing to do. So that adds to the anger and also the weakness of this government in the eyes of the people who ultimately, remember, in a democracy are going to vote. Furthermore, this long-standing idea of Dolchstoss, right back to the beginning, and this is what I was saying earlier, you can talk about those early problems, but only very briefly. Hyperinflation, Versailles, political violence. The people are still alive. That wasn't that long ago, was it? 20 years or so previously, maybe less than that. So people are still alive who remember those horrible times before Stresemann. However, it's difficult to say that that was a cause of the Hitler becoming Chancellor, because in 1928, despite all of that, they still only had 12 seats. So that's why I don't like going that far back. But certainly in a little paragraph about the weaknesses of Weimar, then you could definitely allude to the feeling of Dolchstoss that's been there probably since the beginning, to be honest. And of course, Hitler exploits all that. You also probably want to get into this paragraph, if you can remember, this idea about proportional representation. This highlights the weakness of the Weimar Republic in that every party gets a percentage of their votes, get that many seats in the Reichstag. Of course, that means there's so many parties, it's really hard to agree on anything, especially in a time of crisis, just making the whole government and the whole Weimar Republic look really, really weak, especially dealing with this Great Depression. Sort of similar to that and following on from that, really, the fact that they couldn't make any decisions because of the proportional representation or the coalition groups trying to vie for a deal. Hindenburg and Brüning essentially became a dictatorship during this crisis, using Article 48 over 100 times since the Wall Street crash, including 66 times in 1932. This just shows how weak the Weimar Republic is and how unstable it is on its daily workings. The fact that they just had to pass these laws using Article 48, which, remember, is where they don't need the Reichstag to vote on it. I'm sure difficult times needed difficult things, but this is the problem. The Weimar Republic just looks really weak and a bit chaotic. They also have these 4 elections and 4 chancellors in 1 year, again showing this idea of weakness and instability. Remember that Hitler's going to exploit these things. The ultimate opportunist. He's going to offer strong leadership, one strong leader, none of this coalition stuff, none of this no one agreeing on anything. He's going to take advantage of all of this stuff. And ultimately that comes down to the deal, if you want to include that in this little paragraph. Hindenburg and von Papen, they try to outwit Hitler a little bit. They give him the chancellorship, but only 3 ministers, including Hitler, in the cabinet out of 12. They think that generally that means he's not going to have much power, and it's just a figurehead, but von Papen will essentially still run the government. However, the main point here is that the fact that the government could be manipulated like this shows how weak it is and how dangerous it is that this could happen. So with that in mind, again, there's far too much content on this screen now that you could include in your answer, but let's have a look what this might look like as a written paragraph. Okay, so model paragraph 3, the weakness of the Weimar Republic. Again, we'll start with our opening line. A final reason why Hitler was able to become Chancellor in 1933 was because of the weakness of the Weimar Republic. Again, really clear what the focus of this paragraph is going to be, and using the words of the question. Under the Weimar Constitution of 1919, the Reichstag was elected every 4 years using a system of proportional representation. This meant that each party in the Reichstag was given a percentage of seats that was proportional to the percentage of votes it received. This led to coalition governments that were unstable and found it difficult to have strong policies and often fell apart, especially during a crisis. This was also highlighted during the Great Depression when Brüning used Article 48 over 100 times, 66 in 1932 alone, because there were too many parties to make decisions appearing even weaker. Remember, we keep coming back to that idea that this paragraph is about weakness of Weimar Republic. So our evidence, and we need to explain why that makes it look weak. So carrying on then, the Republic had also suffered since day one, born out of violence. There was a feeling of Dolchstoss in the population regarding the new republic, especially relating to the Treaty of Versailles, memories of hyperinflation in 1923 and the early political violence. Can you see how I've done that in one sentence? I've harked back to the very, very beginning in one sentence. Some of you did a whole paragraph on this. The Great Depression was just another crisis to add to their anger. Furthermore, the fact that there were 4 elections and 4 chancellors in a year shows the Weimar Republic to be weak, culminating in the deal, which Hindenburg gave Hitler what he wanted, but only giving him 3 ministers in the cabinet, including himself, obviously, in an attempt to control him. This shows that the constitution was being manipulated again, showing how it was weak, which Hitler took advantage of by offering stability in government without all of this chaos, resulting in him becoming Chancellor. Now, I've got a bit of analysis here as well that I'll throw in at the end of this paragraph. The deal was inevitable because the essence of the Republic was based on democracy, allegedly, and Hitler had won 230 seats in 1932 democratically, so Hindenburg really didn't have a choice. Just the fact that they tried to do it through some sort of shifty means just gives you an idea about how weak this Republic actually was. All right, so hopefully now you can see with those 3 paragraphs, a really strong 12 marker, probably a little bit more in each of the 3 paragraphs than you'd need in real life. But we've also left out all sorts. We've left out loads of facts that you might have learned for this because we just don't need it all. You just got to make sure that each paragraph is very much focused on whatever you set out as the opening sentence. Again, with the 12 marker, there's no need for introductions or conclusions. If you can spray a little bit of analysis around throughout your paragraphs, even better. All right, so that would be one that I would suggest to you that you do. In this particular mock exam, the other option of your 12 marker is why Hitler was able to reduce unemployment, or I think the words in your paper at the time of this were an economic miracle. Focus on reducing unemployment more so. So let's now take some time to look at this one. Maybe obviously stop the video after the last topic and have a break and then come back to this one. But also, even if you didn't do the unemployment, watch this bit of the video anyway, because this could be your question in real life in the summer, and vice versa. If you did do this one but you didn't do the Germany one, the Rise of Hitler one, then watch that as well. There's no point just missing out because you didn't do that, because the point is we pick these mock exams based on things that we think possibly might come up because they've not been on for a while. So watch them carefully regardless of whether you did them or not. Obviously it's a little bit easier if you have attempted it because you can have a look at your actual answer. Okay, so let's get cracking straight onto this one then. Why was Hitler able to reduce unemployment? This is not an easy topic at all, a very complex essay question, and you do need to know your facts on this one. This is one of those ones where just facts need to be included, otherwise you very much struggle to make your point. So the 2 bullet points that you've been offered were the use of invisible unemployment and the Reich Labour Service, the RAD. So the 3rd bullet point that you might want to pick in this one would be the rearmament industry, rearming the army and the armed forces. I've put in there as well, regarding if it's a, I suppose, an economic miracle question, arguably probably more of a section B, possibly looking at did they fix people's lives. The beauty of labour and the strength through joy could be coming in there a little bit as well. As we're going to focus on reducing unemployment, the beauty of labour and strength through joy, it was more about getting people to work harder and longer for less, not necessarily reducing unemployment. So I would possibly leave this out on this case. However, there is obviously the economy lesson on our website. If you do want to revise that a little bit more, and I think you probably should as well. It's one of those random topics that just might crop up that people aren't always delighted to have. There's some obvious topics that are good, like the Hitler Youth or the Munich Putsch, whereas I think beauty of labour, the economy, it doesn't always grab people's emotion. So perhaps remind yourself before your exam in the summer to have a little look at the economy and the beauty of labour or strength through joy. As we've said, for the benefit of this 12 marker, let's just focus on the invisible unemployment, the Reich Labour Service, and the rearmament, okay? So again, you need to know facts for this question. It is complex. Those of you that have attempted it have struggled. It definitely hasn't done as well as the Chancellor question, and that's because it lacked the facts, okay? So let's have a little think with this. So you pause the video if you want really quickly, just have a scan of these key points that we want to talk about in a paragraph about invisible unemployment. Essentially, invisible unemployment is just a bit sly. They're fudging the figures a little bit to make it look like it's better than what it actually is. So you can see there a bit of the RAD, the armed forces, women and Jews, change in statistics, and prisons. So in the black box is some of the things that we might want to think about if we're planning this paragraph. Invisible unemployment was a means by which the Nazis could reduce that figure from the 6 million using questionable methods, shall we say. Although people were in the labour service, a scheme for the unemployed, they weren't counted as unemployed. So on the unemployment figures, sorry. So they weren't doing really anything. They were in a scheme because they had to be, but they took them off the unemployment figures, even though they weren't actually necessarily technically employed. A little bit of fudging the figures, but we'll explain that in the paragraph, hopefully. All right. Women and Jews lost their jobs. They were given to the unemployed men. This hasn't created new jobs, but they obviously will take women and Jews off the statistics. So essentially what they've done is they're taken, as far as women are concerned, probably around about half the population away, which clearly is going to help reduce unemployment on their figures. So they're counted part-time workers as full-time as well, so just fudging the statistics a little bit. And people were sent to camps or prisons, and they were obviously then taken off the figures. So they haven't created the jobs, they've just not counted that amount of people. Everyone that gets sent to prisons, it comes off. We're talking like hundreds of thousands of people here that have come off that total 6 million figure. They haven't created those jobs, they just took them off the figures because they're in prison. All right, so hopefully you can see this is quite a nice paragraph. It's a little bit of a silly one, really, but clever. You could argue it's clever. So many people joined the army, but in peacetime they didn't do anything. So technically they're not unemployed, but they're not doing anything either, are they? So little things like this is what we want to try and get across in this first paragraph. It's called invisible unemployment, essentially fake unemployment. So let's see how this might look as a paragraph. We'll start, as always, with the opening line. Hopefully you're getting used to that now as you watch this video. One way the Nazis were able to reduce unemployment was using invisible unemployment. So I'm focused on the question and I've given a really clear point. When the Nazis came to power, there were 6 million people unemployed after the Great Depression. Firstly, the Nazis removed work from the Jews, giving their jobs to German men, so not technically creating new jobs. They also took jobs away from women, expecting them to go home and be wives and mothers, following the Kinderkirche policy. Their jobs were given to men, so again, not exactly creating new jobs. However, the statistics don't lie. They have taken women off. That means they've reduced unemployment. Another way in which the Nazis used invisible unemployment was by changing the statistics. They counted part-time workers as full-time workers, again enhancing the numbers of workers, even though they haven't actually set up that many new full-time workers. As well as this, the Nazis employed people in the security services such as the SS and the Gestapo, and 1.3 million in the armed forces. This was again manipulating the figures, as in peacetime there was no real work for these soldiers to do, but they were counted as employed, and the security services weren't real jobs, but still counted. Possibly just pushing paper across a desk and things like that, sort of looking around streets, but not actually doing anything. Finally, the Nazis put unemployed people into the labour service, which meant they were doing something, but they weren't actual jobs. However, they no longer counted on the statistics, so using invisible unemployment was a good way to reduce the unemployment figures, despite the fact they haven't actually created these new jobs. So again, you can see this is a much sort of weaker paragraph than the Chancellor ones in this video, but there's clearly enough points and facts in this one and a bit of evidence to argue why invisible unemployment has helped reduce unemployment. All right, so then paragraph 2, the Reich Labour Service, the RAD. The stuff we want to maybe think about in this is this was paid work for the unemployed. They had to do this hard manual work, really low pay to be fair, poor conditions, poor food. So some of the examples that you're going to want to bring into this paragraph will be draining the marshes, planting trees, bridges, coastal walls, and sports facilities. Obviously the Berlin Olympic Stadium is going to be your biggest example. Lovely fact, and actually crucial fact, all 18 to 25-year-olds had to do 6 months in the RAD, reducing unemployment by 422,000. So that's 422,000 people off that 6 million, even though they haven't really created proper jobs. They've just put them into this service, if you like. Also, it was compulsory, so they had to do it, all 18 to 25-year-olds. So then the Autobahn would be another good example of the RAD labour service. In 1935, they built 7,000 miles of road, which employed a further 125,000 people. So I suppose you could argue that's a proper job. But that's another chunk off the unemployment figure. So these unemployed people were no longer counted as unemployed, even though this was just a little scheme to make sure that 18 to 25-year-olds had to do it. All right, so let's have a little look into this as a paragraph. It looks a bit harder, doesn't it, to turn those 4 bullet points into a whole paragraph, but you'll see how we can manage that now. So we'll begin with another way in which the Nazis were able to create an economic miracle and reduce unemployment was through the Reich Labour Service. The RAD was a government-funded scheme that gave unemployed men jobs to do, very often meaningless jobs that didn't contribute to the economy but got them doing something. These jobs were hard manual work in poor conditions and for poor pay, and were often in public services. Some of the jobs the RAD did were draining marshes, planting trees, building coastal defences and building sports facilities, for example the Olympic Stadium in 1936. In 1935, all 18 to 25-year-olds had to join the RAD, which further reduced unemployment by another 422,000. A significant job creation was the Autobahns, which was 7,000 miles of roads leading to a further 125,000 jobs in 1935. So we're given loads of evidence in this here, aren't we, about how the Reich Labour Service is throwing numbers at us. Some nice facts to know, but you do have to include these facts, otherwise you're sort of losing a lot of value. I've got a bit of analysis in here as well now about the Autobahn that did actually help the economy, as it allowed for better transport of goods and supplies around the country, improving industry and agriculture. These jobs might not have been the most effective and were poorly paid and difficult, but the RAD was just another way that the Nazis reduced unemployment, leading to an economic miracle. Okay, so again, those 4 smaller bullet points, you can see there's a lot less information for this question, isn't there, than the Rise to Chancellor one. But if we're clever about it, we can get these numbers in and we can fluff our explanations a little bit. We can clearly keep answering this question and saying how this led to work. All right, so finally then, paragraph 3 is the rearmament and the military, sorry, not the RAD, ignore the RAD bit on this, but the rearmament of the military. Just we need to get this story in about the Treaty of Versailles for starters, don't we? German army was reduced to just 100,000, remember? And when Hitler becomes the Führer, he essentially rips up the treaty and immediately rearms the army. The Enabling Act obviously gets rid of those foreign treaties. And then by 1939, there were an extra 1.4 million soldiers. These are numbers that you just simply have to be including in this question. They also increased workers in the armament factories, so making weapons and planes and boats, etc. And another nice little number there is 72,000 workers by 1935. So after just 2 years of being in power, 72,000 aircraft constructors. All right, and then a third bullet point, again showing you this paragraph might be a little bit tricky to fluff out. As well as the rearmament factories making weapons, there were jobs created to make uniforms as well. So again, a bit naff, but let's see how we might be able to get this into a paragraph. So we'll start with a final reason. Because it's the third paragraph, we can say a final way the Nazis were able to reduce unemployment and create an economic miracle was through their rearmament programs. Following World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's army was reduced to a maximum of 100,000 soldiers, with 0 air force along with 6 battleships. So we get to get a little bit of our Versailles knowledge in there. Hitler immediately, when in total power, ignored this and began rearming Germany. By 1939, there were an extra 1.4 million soldiers in the army. Although in peacetime there would be no real need for soldiers, they did at least have jobs and so reduced the unemployment figures again. So we're going back to the question there regularly, aren't we? As well as recruiting into the army, the rearmament program also saw new factories to build planes, ships and other weapons. And by 1935, there were 72,000 more workers creating aircraft. People were generally better paid if working in the armament factories, showing the commitment that Hitler had to this rearmament program. Finally, factories were set up to create the uniforms of the armed forces again, further reducing the unemployment figures. By 1939, Nazi figures had unemployment down from 6 million to 2, appearing to deliver on their promises, which is why many continue to support the Nazis in power, thus creating an economic miracle. So a little bit of analysis ending the whole essay there with the fact is that they have reduced unemployment like they promised they would. Obviously this essay is focused on how they did that. If this was a section B, we could obviously have one interpretation of how great the Nazis did deal with the economy, but also how flawed it was because it wasn't real. So you could clearly have 2 good interpretations for that. That might be one that you want to practice as you're revising the economy. Just practice it as if it was a section B. Make up the interpretations if you want to, because essentially the script stays the same. All right, so that's the end of our section A on this paper. We've had 2 12 markers to consider and the inference question. So now we get on to section B, which is by far the most important. It's worth the most, but is also the easiest, okay, because there's a script for almost every question. So the whole of section B is going to be based on attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. You need to be writing that at least 10 times over the next 4 questions. Attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. So every question is going to be about attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. See in this photograph here, if this was going to be a source, this might suggest people are very happy. Look how proud they look. Obviously, with Hitler in the middle of it, they're not going to look otherwise, are they? But again, that's just a little bit of practice and just thinking about how we can maybe infer from these things. So let's get started on section B then, looking at the first question, question 3A, which is our source question. How useful are these sources for an inquiry into attitudes of the Hitler Youth? Exactly the same as the source question on the trenches paper, but again, just a little bit weak, I'd say. Not as strongly done as it should be. So take your time to watch this, look at the answers, and also look at some of the pitfalls, okay? So how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into attitudes towards the Hitler Youth? That's what we need to keep looking at, is attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. So our structure, no need for an introduction or conclusion, no need to compare the sources, say B is more useful than C, don't do any of that. Keep your source analysis of each source separate, so 1 paragraph for source B and 1 paragraph for source C. Don't mix them up, don't merge them, just do source B first and then source C. Please you're losing marks by getting yourself all mixed up. Make sure you're saying why your points have helped to make the source useful in relation to the question, which of course is attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. Don't just say it's a letter, full stop. Say why that makes it a useful source. Hopefully I'll make that clear in my model answers. When you bring your own knowledge in, make sure you're including what you know. Assume the examiner doesn't know anything, so don't imply your knowledge by saying something like, I know this is true. All right, so write a quote and then I know this is true. You've got to say what you know that is true. Just presume they don't know anything, okay? But be really specific as well. That's a little bit where we faltered down a little bit on this, is your knowledge. Time management, be specific, be good on your time. Make sure you're noting when you start these questions now, and you should obviously be on to section B after about 25 minutes, half an hour maximum. You should be on to section B then. All right. So you do need quite a lot of work for this question for just 8 marks. We know that the source question is a little bit tricky, but as long as you follow the script and you don't go on one, just do your 2 points, your 2 quotes and your 2 bits of backup evidence, and then a bit of provenance and move on, okay? We've got to make sure that we move on because we need to get onto the big essay questions. So we need to, in both these paragraphs, COCO, PP, make sure you give some reference to 2 quotes and back them up with your own knowledge, and then 2 points relating to the provenance. So remember, each paragraph separately should look like what you can see now on the screen in the red boxes. So source B, paragraph 1, you need some content plus some own knowledge to back that up. Another quote, back it up with some own knowledge, and then 2 examples of how the provenance makes the source useful. And then repeat for paragraph 2, source C. But also remember that every source is useful. Don't be negative, don't criticize the sources. All right, so as we're looking at just feedback for your mock exam on this, just for revision on the Hitler Youth, there is another video which I'll put in the link below for this video. Just get your head sorted with the Hitler Youth content, as well as there's also a walkthrough, and again at the end of that video, how to do section B, whereas this is more just feedback for your actual mock. So again, the link for that one will be in the comments below. Okay, so let us think about, first of all, working out the content. The reason why you get a tiny bit longer on this exam paper than the medicine one really is because you've got to do a bit of reading. So we've got our source B, we want to try and pick out some content, okay? So I'm just going to put on the bottom there some of the most obvious things that should jump out at you. The source is useful because it suggests some people didn't like the Hitler Youth movement because it was only preparing them for military service. That should be obvious when you read that. You could also mention the source is also useful because it provides evidence of resentment towards the hard physical activities. It's useful because it suggests there was little variety in activities carried out by the Hitler Youth. And in context, by 1939, Hitler Youth numbers were going down, despite it being compulsory, which supports this boy's view. So we're going to try and get some of that into our answer here, because the mark scheme talks about contextual own knowledge. So we could bring a little bit of that in. So that's our knowledge. We want to use that knowledge to back up some of the content. So where you see a colour now, this would be a quote. This would be what we might put in our paragraph, which you'll see in a minute. We might just quote that blue box there. Source B says there is little enthusiasm, we don't have a minute of the day to ourselves, and then you would back that up with a little bit of knowledge about what that means and what you know. We could also pick out this pink one. This isn't camp life, no sir, it's army life, drill starts, blah, blah, blah. Again, you could pick that one out. Remember, we only need 2 sentences in our answer, but we're just picking out 3 or maybe even 4. He then goes on to say, we would like to have athletics, but there isn't any. So we could add a bit of own knowledge to that too. And then lastly, if you wanted to, he talks about having military exercises down in the mud till our tongues hang out of our mouths. We only have one wish to sleep, sleep, sleep. So there are 4 things that I have highlighted in this source. You only need 2. All right, so pick the 2 that you think you can talk the most about and make sure you do. And then obviously that contextual knowledge underneath there as well. All right, so with that said, with our source annotated almost, if you like, with C, 4 C's there, we just need 2, remember. These are some of the things that you might add for some own knowledge to back those up. So you could discuss the activities of the Hitler Youth, how structured and regimented they are, how they were preparing them for war. You know this stuff, so this is where you'd say, I know that. It's ordered around by older boys. You could talk about that, having to follow instructions from the minute they wake up to the minute they sleep, and maybe how some of them didn't like that. You could bring a little bit of that in if you want. You could add, what activities do they do at the Hitler Youth? Physical, military, political, character building, hard, pressurised, bullied, etc. A little bit of our knowledge, but remember, we don't have time for you to write masses on this. You can do that in the big essay at the end of section B. And then an inference if you want. Sometimes it's good to make an inference in a source question. There's definitely an edge here that this boy doesn't like the Hitler Youth. He talks about what was expected and what he got. Obviously thinking it used to be fun and now it's not. Maybe you could comment on how it seems to have changed from what it used to be. Maybe consider 1936 could be useful for this. That's the year, of course, that it became compulsory. And as we're getting towards the late 1930s, we're getting towards preparation for World War II. So a little bit of old knowledge there to back up just 2 of those. Remember, only pick 2. All right, so let's see some provenance before we look at a model answer or model paragraph for source B. So the yellow box highlights the provenance. It's always information above the actual source. Okay, so we've got obvious things here that we're picking out. The author is a member of the Hitler Youth and he's writing about his own experiences in 1936. That's really useful because he's basing it on his own experiences. We want to be commenting on the idea that he seems to be representing a genuine view because he's prepared to criticise the Hitler Youth in a private letter to his friend, despite the possibility of him getting in a lot of trouble if this is caught. So he's obviously telling the truth, isn't he? And you know he is because it's accurate what he says. It's also private, so he only intended his friend to see it, meaning he was probably honest in his views to his friend. These are all the things you'd be expected to say about provenance. So there's 2 there straight away, but a third one, just in case you needed it. We only need 2 though. You want to be talking about that 1936, definitely. This is the year it became compulsory. You should be reflecting on that. This might explain why he has such a negative view about the Hitler Youth, because he's been forced to go, and you can make that inference as well. So with that said then, for the last couple of minutes, we've been looking at this source B. We've picked out some content. We've got some contextual own knowledge that we could add. And then we've had a little bit of a provenance. Pick 2 of these bullet points on the screen now. So let's just have a little look how this would look as a paragraph. Remember, just about source B. Okay. So source B is very useful. So I've started it by making that red so you can see I have made my judgment. Very useful. You could say extremely useful, particularly useful, whatever you want, but it's always useful, okay? So always start with source B is useful. And then, of course, as we keep saying in this video, using the words of the question for an inquiry into attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. So then firstly, source B says, there is little enthusiasm, we don't have a minute of the day to ourselves. So we've ticked off our content. We've got our quote in straight away. Then I need to back up that bit of quote. So I've said with my own knowledge, this is particularly useful as it shows us that some children have negative attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. I know that it was difficult, so I know that. It was difficult at the camps and were being prepared for war. So lots of the activities were about the military and order as well as following orders. There were lots of activities from the minute they woke up to the minute they went back to sleep, like drills and marches. So a bit of our knowledge in there. Plenty. We don't need any more than that. We haven't got time for any more than that. Then we want to get into our second CO now. So source B also says, that is the easiest way of getting a quote in, isn't it? Because it says, obviously if it was a picture, you'd say source B shows. But in this case, it says, we would like to have athletics, but there isn't any. This is, again, very useful as it shows us that it wasn't the physical activities they hated, but the drills, that should say. It seems that this boy believed he was going to be getting a different experience with fun activities like hiking, sports and team games. That's me bringing in some more knowledge. Instead, he's upset to be focused purely on military aspects of the camp. Military activities are usually combined with character building, political activities, and other physical activities. So that's our CO done twice. Now we need to get our provenance at the end of the paragraph. Source B is a private letter written by a Hitler Youth member to his friend. This makes it more useful as he is clearly telling the truth, as he only expects his friend to read it. So we could put in there as well that he's based on his own experiences. That, of course, makes it useful, but we don't need it. We only need 2 bits of provenance. Moreover, there is a chance he could get into trouble for being so negative, further supporting that it is the truth. It's also it's like he doesn't care anymore, isn't it? That's how bad it is. It's also accurate what he is saying. So we're saying that we know what he's saying is true. He's not lying about it, even though he might lie to not get in trouble. He clearly isn't, because we know that this is typical. It was written in 1936, which is more useful as this is the year the Hitler Youth became compulsory, clearly explaining his negative attitude and highlighting the reasoning for this was a change in preparation for war. So we keep saying that, especially that last little bit there, clearly explaining his negative attitude. That's what the question is about, isn't it? It's asking us about attitude towards the Hitler Youth, not just what did the Hitler Youth do. You need to be saying how that affected the attitudes. All right, so hopefully that makes sense how we've turned our planning and our sort of annotating of the source into a little paragraph here. Obviously a couple of spelling mistakes in there as well, but don't worry too much about that. That's inevitable when you're writing quickly. So let's have a look at source C then. So source C, again, we'll break through the basics of it, what jumps out at us when we read it. It's useful because it suggests some of the young were very enthusiastic about the Hitler Youth. That's good for us. It's also useful because it provides evidence of some of the attractions of the Hitler Youth, especially the camping trips. It's also useful because it suggests that Hitler Youth encouraged friendship and teamwork. And in context, the Hitler Youth remained popular and kept going right up until the end of the Second World War. We know that. They were willing to die, weren't they, in the streets of Berlin. And some are very keen because it offered an escape from the otherwise boring, narrow life and opportunities they had at home. So we know that little bit of contextual knowledge. So let's, again, as we've done before with our highlighting, highlight some of the content. So again, there's one sentence we could pick in our paragraph. We could have this one, we could have this one, or we could have this one. So we've got 4 sentences. Again, we just need 2. You make sure that you pick the 2 sentences or 2 quotes that you think you can talk the most about in the paragraph. The thing you know a little bit more about that you can back that up with. Ultimately, the O is backing up the C. Okay, so that's our quotes. Let's have a little look at some of the O knowledge we could add to that. So we know full well that you need to be talking about the things that they did that brought them together, the team sports, the hiking, the competitions, whatever it was, whatever example you think of. And there's hundreds of things that these boys did at the Hitler Youth, isn't there? You want to talk about the belonging of pride it brings, the honour, being part of something bigger, and especially the chaos that's just been during the Depression. This Hitler Youth offers them just something really, really powerful and, stable. Talking in army terms, talk about comrades, the word comrade. They're willing to fight and die together, preparing for the war. We know that they were quite happy to die for Hitler. The trips were also an opportunity that many children would not have been able to go on in the past, especially from a poor family. This brought pride in their country and their building for the future. They are the master race. So all of this stuff you could be bringing in as your own knowledge to back up 2 of those quotes. And obviously a little bit of an inference if you want. This boy is obviously more positive, recalling how he joined the Deutsche Jungvolk, the DJ, and presumably having been in the Hitler Youth from an early age right up to being a leader. So we know that the DJ was the younger kids. So the fact that he's a leader of the Hitler Youth when he wrote this, or when he was in the Hitler Youth, he's clearly gone through the whole process. So that's probably why he's so positive, because he's been there from the very beginning. Things like that we might want to include. Okay, so again, just before we crack on to our actual paragraph, we're going to do a little bit of annotating before we start, just to make sure we know what we're writing about. You're already sort of picking it out of the source, which gives you a prompt when it comes to writing the paragraph. The yellow box highlights the provenance of this source. So we want to be considering that it's from the memories of someone given in 1954, when he did not have to worry about towing the party line anymore because the Nazis are long gone, and he's got nothing to fear from being honest, okay? That might be something you say. It's quite a fair point, I think. He's got plenty of time to reflect on his experience being 1954, so, a good 20 years later maybe a little bit less. This makes it even more useful, especially as he's been able to think about what he's saying. And of course, what he does say in there is accurate. You know it's accurate. You might, if you really wanted to be critical a little bit, which even though we're saying be positive, If you notice something wrong, then say it, but you won't notice anything wrong because Edexcel want you to be positive. So this is typical of a Hitler Youth leader. He's also a Hitler Youth leader, so you might want to consider why that makes the source more useful. Slightly different outlook or experience to the other members than the normal boys. He's the one giving out the instructions, so maybe that's why he feels a bit more positive about it all, because he's not actually doing it. He's also evidently been in the Hitler Youth for a very long time, from the Deutsche Jungvolk right up to the Hitler Youth. That makes what he's saying even more reliable. So they're the kind of things that you might want to say when you consider the provenance. Okay, so when you are ready, if you want to maybe pause this and have a look back at the last little bit, or if you're ready to go straight into the paragraph, let's do that now. All right, so source C is also very useful for an inquiry into attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. I've given my judgment and I've used the words of the question. Straight away, I've got my quote in there. Source C says, "What I liked about the Hitler Youth was the comradeship. This is very useful to show attitudes towards the Hitler Youth that clearly some children really enjoyed it. I know that the Hitler Youth brought a great sense of belonging and pride to the children who attended and convinced them that they were part of something big. Also, how important the youth are to Hitler and the country. It also offered the stability and strength that had been lacking following the Depression." So we've got our own knowledge, and now we go straight into our second quote. Source C also says, "And then there were the trips, especially camping." This again is very useful as it shows an excitement about going on a trip. I know that for many young people, especially in recent years, the idea of going away on a trip was out of the question. So the Hitler Youth offered these children many exciting opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise get. Source C is from a book, so we're on to provenance already here, about the Hitler Youth, published in 1954. This is useful as the book will have been created to inform the reader about the Hitler Youth, so we've got a bit of purpose there. Why was it made? It's accurate too, which makes it even more useful. Being published in 1954, so we're now talking about the when, makes it more useful because the writer has had time to reflect on his experiences before writing about them. Also, he doesn't have to toe the party line as it is in 1954. We've probably got enough there to stop this paragraph now. We've got 2 bits of provenance and we've got our COCO. However, if you've got time, we should put this last little bit in just to guarantee. It's also useful because it's written by a Hitler Youth leader in the 1930s, so it's based on his own actual experiences that are typical of the experiences of a Hitler Youth leader. He has been more positive an attitude, which is probably because he was given the orders, not doing the hard work. He's also been in the Hitler Youth from a very young age, as he recalls joining the Young Boys, so has gone through the whole rank, making source C even more useful. So definitely we could do without maybe the last couple of sentences on this, especially if we are running out of time, just to show you that we don't need everything. We just need to do what they need us to do in the mark scheme. All right. So that is our source question done. It is only worth 8 marks, and it's a lot of work for 8 marks. However, if we do follow our script, we should be able to be getting at least 5 out of this. We need to just get a little bit better, and it just takes practice and you sticking to the script. Do not go off script because you're just not getting yourself any marks, and don't be merging your paragraphs and comparing sources directly. Okay, so that's the first bit of section B done. We've spent the time we need on that, maybe about 18 minutes or so, and then we're going to get on to the interpretations now. So these are our 2 4 markers that we should be getting 8 out of 8 every single time, so 2 4s. We need to make sure you're following the feedback in this video really carefully and looking at your papers to see why you didn't get full marks out of it, okay? And sometimes it's because you haven't used the script properly, and you've missed the point a little bit. So question 3B, 4 marks, is asking us essentially, what is the difference in views between interpretation 1 and 2 about attitudes towards Hitler Youth? Don't forget the focus of our question. So what is the difference in the views? And this is where some people get 3C wrong, because they just repeat what they say now instead of why are they different. So for now, let's just put a little bit of a script box on there. Remember the script. The view of interpretation 1 is, I can tell this because it says. So let's see that in practice. So have a little read of interpretation 1, and then we'll have a little look at a model answer. So the script is really careful. In the red is the script. The view of interpretation 1 about attitudes towards the Hitler Youth is that many children had a positive attitude towards it. Before that should have been towards the Hitler Youth, towards it. I can tell this because it says is our script, and then we pick out one sentence that's quite positive. Many young people were attracted by the exciting and interesting activities of the youth movement. So that's quite clear. That should take you, what, a minute, 2 minutes to do that? Obviously, you need to make sure that you're reading carefully, and when you're trying to work out what the view is about attitudes towards Hitler Youth in this case, it won't always be positive and negative. It could be successful and not successful. It could be liked and didn't like, something like that. It's not always just one's positive, one's negative. It could be, I don't know, if it's terror, how did Hitler control the country? It could be which of these terror was the most effective. So we've got to try and make sure we do understand what the views are. It's not as simple as just this little script, but you should be able to work it out roughly, okay? And you should also have a bit of an idea by now, having just done the source question, you should be starting to think to yourself, right, okay, I get the feeling that these interpretations are going to be positive and negative, because that's essentially how the sources came across a little bit. So anyway, we follow on with whereas, so that just flips us over to the next interpretation, number 2. The view of interpretation 2 about attitudes towards the Hitler Youth, remember we got to use the words of the question, is that many children had a more negative attitude towards it. And then the script, I can tell this because it says, and I've just picked out a quote that's a bit negative, some youngsters began to kick against the restrictions of the Hitler Youth. There's our 4 marks, move on. I say 4 minutes for this, 4 or 5 minutes. You could get this done hopefully within that 4 or 5 minutes. It just, obviously 2 of those minutes might be reading and trying to figure out a little bit what you're saying. Okay, so that's 3B, nailed. 4 out of 4 every time, use the script. 3C is asking us, why do these interpretations have different views about attitudes towards the Hitler Youth? And some of you are coming up with some right random things for this, just totally forgetting the script. It doesn't matter when it was made and who made it. This is not what this question is asking, so don't waste your time on that. But there is a script, okay? Our script, as we know, is very, very simple for this one. They are different because they are based on different sources. So you'll say interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about the attitudes towards the Hitler Youth because they are based on different sources. Now we know that already because we've done the source question already. So it should be easy for you to match up the interpretations to the sources you've just looked at. So we're going to start our script with the next bit in red. Interpretation 1 is based on sources like source C. So we need to say based on sources like source C rather than just source C, because no historian would look at just one source when they're writing a book. They look at lots of sources. All right, and then we have to match them up with 2 quotes of something they both say that's quite similar. So we've said interpretation 1 is based on sources like source C, as they both talk about the positives. Interpretation 1 talks about the exciting activities, and source C talks about the trips and camping. So we can clearly see in there that we've got evidence from both of them that show they're quite similar. Interpretation 2 is based on sources like source B, so the other source, as they both talk about the negatives of the Hitler Youth. Interpretation 2 says some youngsters began to kick against the restrictions, and source B talks about all of the drills they have to do and have no free time. So 2 bits of evidence from those that are negative, and that's it. 4 marks, done, move on. You should be getting 8 out of 8. And it's a bit frustrating when we mark some of these things and you're just not following the script because you're throwing marks away. Yeah, okay, reading might not be the strength of yours, so trying to work stuff out might be a little bit trickier, but still you could do the script and you're going to pick up some marks just by doing the script. And it never changes. It just never changes. The only thing that changes are the quotes that you put in and whatever the focus of the question is. The script essentially stays the same. All right, so hopefully you can see that and have a look at your papers, particularly for these last 2 questions, because we need to be getting 8 out of 8. And hopefully you can see why you didn't get 8 out of 8. All right, and then that leaves us with about half an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer if we can, to do question 3D, the 20 marker. How far do you agree? All right, and I love this question. Hopefully that's coming across to you in class. It's not like the other big essays where you've got to be really clever and analytical and you've got to be comparing. You're basically saying in this question how they're both correct, and you have to just prove that. Okay, so we've now done the interpretations work. We've talked about the interpretations in the previous questions. You never need to talk about the sources ever again. That's done now. Only 3C and 3A do you need to talk about sources. Forget the sources now. Just work on the interpretations. So this question is asking you, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about attitudes towards the Hitler Youth? So again, we keep coming back to that question. All right, so the things that we want to be considering here is the structure. You've got to give your judgment in an introduction, as always, with the big essays. If you're being asked how far do you agree, you need to tell them how far you agree, to a larger extent or to a lesser extent. It's the same as ever. This should be happening every single time now. And it is mostly, so well done for that. But some of you are still not quite given that judgment in the opening sentence. Then after you've done your introduction, and maybe if you can give a little bit of a thesis statement, as always, just a brief why you think that, you need 2 paragraphs in this case. 1 paragraph about interpretation 2 and why it's correct, and then another paragraph about interpretation 1 and why that view is correct. Essentially, why is it true that the Hitler Youth was bad, and why is it true that Hitler Youth was good? And then a conclusion where you're going to argue. This is now where you say why you agree with one more than the other, about attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. But the 2 paragraphs of the essay, the main bit of the essay, it's literally in front of you. So use the quotes from the interpretation and just add a little bit of knowledge to it. All right, so it's very similar to the source question in the sense of COCO, quote, oh knowledge, quote, oh knowledge. At least 2 quotes. You'll see in my model answer we're going to put maybe 3 in each. But you do not need any provenance for this, and there's no need to mention the sources, okay? So just quote and then back it up with some knowledge. Make sure you've got at least 30 minutes for this. Whatever's going on elsewhere in the paper, you need to be making sure you're moving on. You've got to be really disciplined from when section A needs to be done after about half an hour max. You then need to start working your way through the source questions and the 2 interpretations. Just make sure you've got half an hour to do this. All right. The body of the essay, both interpretations are correct. Do not forget that. Whether you agree or not is kind of irrelevant in this essay, which is why I quite like it, because you just basically have to say, oh, they're both right in these big paragraphs about how, yes, the Hitler Youth was bad and how it wasn't. So just say that, all right? Don't merge your interpretations. Don't mix paragraph 1 to paragraph 2. Don't merge, just like in the source question, don't bring a bit of interpretation 2 into paragraph. Just 2 separate paragraphs about these interpretations will keep it very much focused, okay? But you do need to get the script right so as to not get that mixed up, and you'll see that why in the model answer in a minute. The script is very easy. You're just going to make it clear to the examiner that you've said interpretation 2 is, but you're also acknowledging that the view of interpretation 1 is also correct as well. And that's something really that's quite obvious. You can relate to that, be it football. You've watched the football game and you and your mate have got a different view of what happened, but you're right and so is your mate because that's how you saw it. So that's the point of this question really. They're both correct because that's their view, that's their opinion. You can't say that they're wrong. You can just say that you disagree with them, but you also have to acknowledge why what they're saying is true as well. All right, so then we need to discuss, not discuss the provenance. No need for who made it, when was it made, just ignore that. Some of you did that and you got yourself really bogged down and spent loads of time and got absolutely 0 marks for it, so don't do that. All right, and then this little cherry on the cake for this question, if we can get a bit of tone into our answer, either in the paragraphs or in the conclusion at the end, it's just going to get you your top marks essentially, okay? So don't worry about it too much. Try and consider the tone of the interpretations, why that might make you prefer one more than the other. Is the language a bit too emotional? Is it too vague? Is one more focused on one aspect and one is more broad? If you don't like the tone, make sure you say why. If it's lacking facts and you're criticizing it, say why it should have, what facts should have included. There are endless possibilities for this little tone, so I can't tell you what you definitely need to prepare for. It's just a feeling on the day. You might just have a feeling that it's just a little bit too emotional, or you might like the fact that it's emotional, I don't know. But you've got to basically try and say why the tone of it, why you prefer one than the other. Okay, so that is the crutch of the matter, and very briefly in the 2 red boxes, similarly to the sources, is how you should set this out. Start with interpretation 2 first, because that is what the question is asking you, but a little bit more knowledge this time. Okay, so structure-wise, you can just pause the screen and have a look at this bit yourself, just to show you how we should set it out. As we've said, the introduction, how far do you agree? Paragraph 1, why is it correct? The script is there. So open the paragraph by saying the view of interpretation 2 is the Hitler Youth wasn't very popular and is correct. Make sure you put that bit in, and is correct. And then similarly to the source question, you pick out a couple of sentences, at least 2, and back that up with some knowledge that you've got as well about why the Hitler Youth was bad. If you can get a bit of tone in there, do it there. Otherwise, just wait till the introduction, the conclusion, and then repeat for paragraph 2. So why interpretation 1 is correct. So the script again starts with, on the other hand, the view of interpretation 1 is that the Hitler Youth was very popular, and this is also correct. And then some quotes and some knowledge. Okay, and then your conclusion. State again why you agree or disagree, but this time say why. So like a proper historian, why do you think the Hitler Youth was bad? Or why do you think the Hitler Youth was actually good overall? And then if you can get a little bit of tone, language, content, things like that in there as well, that should see you nicely. So this is definitely a question that you've done really well on as a whole. So continue that. Don't lose the practice of it now. Keep practicing it for the last few months before we get to the summer. All right. As always with these things, there's some quotes help. It's a feedback video, so these are some of the quotes that you might want to pick out, or you should have picked out perhaps, to put into your paragraphs. So the first 3 are from interpretation 2, with a little bit of help on what that would help and what knowledge you might be able to bring in. So you could pause the video and have a read of them yourself. Also check what quotes you put in. What did you pick out in your actual answer compared to what this video was suggesting? Does not necessarily mean that yours are wrong, by the way. I'm just picking out examples of what I see. And of course, these are often my views. These model answers are what I think. That doesn't mean that you have to agree. And then the bottom 3 are obviously from interpretation 1. So maybe just pause the video and have a quick read of these, especially the yellow bits, to see if they are the quotes that you picked out and put into your answer. You'll see that I have put them into my answer. Okay, so with that said, a little bit of a plan. Again, you've got time on this question if you use the time wisely. Just have a quick scribble on your exam paper about what you want to include. These are just examples of things that would support the fact that it wasn't popular and things that would support the fact that it was. Again, you cannot possibly talk about all of those things. Just have a pause the video, have a quick read of those and think, oh yeah, I know that. Maybe which ones do you know? Have a look at the content that you did include. What old knowledge did you bring in? Did you know some of the things you're looking at on the screen but you just forgot on the day? Or did you not have time to put it in? And just see, maybe your knowledge that you put in is not on the screen right now, but doesn't mean that you're not valid. All right, so that little bit of planning time before you start this 20 marker, just on your exam paper, maybe just do a little table like this quickly and scribble down some examples that you want to talk about that support interpretation 2, and examples, scribble down some facts and things you want to bring in that support interpretation 1 as well. Whatever the topic's about, Hitler Youth, Munich Putsch, I don't know, whatever, the economy, just try and have a bit of a two-sided argument before you go. But of course, if you are having a total brain fog, remember the sources will trigger you a little bit. They'll remind you of some things. So use the sources. Don't name the sources, but just if you really have forgotten everything, just bring something out of those sources. Pretend it's your own, all right? But also the interpretations will trigger you with some information as well. So don't panic too much. That's where this question is quite good. In fact, the whole of section B is quite good. If you'd have a bit of a brain fog, you've got a lot of content in front of you that will hopefully trigger a little bit of what you need to talk about. So with that said, then let's finish this video off by looking at a model answer for this 20 marker. All right, so when you're happy with looking at this, unpause and we shall carry on. All right, so I'm going to start with my introduction, which is just nice and straightforward. I agree to a larger extent with interpretation 2 that attitudes towards the Hitler Youth were more negative. So I've used the words of the question again, attitudes towards the Hitler Youth. I've given a judgment and I've reminded the examiner what the view of interpretation 2 is. And then I've given a tiny little bit of a thesis. You can see it doesn't take much. I've said this is because if they weren't, then they wouldn't have had to make it compulsory and they did become all about preparing for war. So I'm basically just saying why I agree with that overall. If it was good, then people would want to go, wouldn't they? So you can see that that's not a huge job, is it, that introduction right there? I've got my judgment and I made it clear what it's about. So now we want to get into the crutch of the essay, 2 nice big paragraphs. All right, so paragraph 1 is about interpretation 2, and that's only because the question says, do you agree with interpretation 2? No, you can do whichever one you want first, doesn't matter. All right, so we're going to start with our script, as always, the start of this thing, on the one hand, and because this is a genuine two-sided argument, there's no third part now, unlike the Elizabeth 16 markers or the medicine 16 markers. This is literally two-sided, one side versus the other. So we can use on the one hand, the view of interpretation 2 is that attitudes towards the Hitler Youth were negative and is correct in this view. So I've said what the view is, I've reminded the examiner what the view is, and I know that already from question 3b, remember. Essentially by this point, you're just doing it without thinking now. That's the view. You've got to remind the examiner what the view is and how it's correct. Then, like the source question, straight into a quote. Firstly, interpretation 2 says, and the quote, the movement became less popular towards the late 1930s as the activities became increasingly focused on preparations for war and the discipline became stricter when membership became compulsory. All right, so a long sentence there, but that's going to help fluff it out a little bit. I'm saying this is true because when the Hitler Youth began, it was much more fun and the children got to take part in a variety of different activities. By 1936, when it became compulsory, it began to be much more focused on preparing the boys for war. A little bit of a spelling there, sorry, but you get the gist. Many of the boys were being bullied and harassed by the leaders for not being good enough or quick enough and also not reaching their standards. Sometimes younger boys were forced to fight older boys, and if they got upset, then they were humiliated. So I've bring in a little bit of old knowledge there just to back up that bit about how people were getting a bit fed up with it. Then we say our second quote, interpretation 2 also says, there was a growing resentment at the way Hitler Youth leaders acted as if they were better than members who were barely younger than they were. This was worsened by the fact that some of the leaders were just a year older than them and they took advantage of their power. So I'm now bringing in a bit of old knowledge. It was no wonder many stopped attending. Some of the boys even killed themselves with their daggers due to the pressures and the bullying. Third quote, interpretation 2 also says some youngsters began to kick against the restrictions of the Hitler Youth, which is also true as alternative groups began. For example, the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swing Youth groups. These were middle-class children who could afford to import American music and held illegal dances. These groups didn't go to Hitler Youth meetings, instead hung around on fields, smoked, drank and listened to American music, as well as dressing in these American clothes. So I'm giving you some good old knowledge here about these alternative groups and proving the quote that some kids rebelled against it. They also chased Hitler Youth children after their meetings. When these groups were caught, they were often hanged. So it's clear that interpretation 2 is correct in the view that many children hated the Hitler Youth. I've given, hopefully, plenty of evidence in there. I've got 3 quotes. That's more than we need, really. We just need 2 minimum. But if we can get 3 quotes in there, and then the quotes essentially will just maybe help you in fluffing that out a little bit with some own knowledge. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Maybe read it again to yourself without me talking over it. And compare to your first paragraph. How does yours look compared to this? All right, again, possibly with that is a little bit more than we need time-wise. But if you can do something like this in the half an hour, then we're in a really, really good place. So then we want to flip over to paragraph 2 with a view of interpretation 1 this time. So we're going to say, on the other hand, the view of interpretation 1 is that attitudes towards the Hitler Youth were more positive, and is also correct in this view. So again, we've told the examiner what the view is. We've also told the examiner that we accept this person is correct as well. And now I'm just going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you why we agree with this person. So straight in with our first quote again. Firstly, interpretation 1 says, many young people were attracted by the exciting and interesting activities of the youth movements. This is true as many of the young people never left their villages. Their families were poor and so never would have had access to such exciting opportunities. Going away to camps with their friends would have been incredible for them. Nice little bit of own knowledge there, quite clearly. The Hitler Youth meetings were often split into different categories where the children would do some political activities, some military activities and drills, as well as physical activities and character building. So a nice bit of knowledge there too of the things they did at a typical Hitler Youth meeting. These games were often lots of fun, playing with their friends, and had an element of competition that they enjoyed. Most boys thrived off the challenges of jumping out of buildings blindfolded and jumping over fires. So again, bringing in a little bit of knowledge. Interpretation 1 also says some enjoyed the military aspect of the youth movements, the uniforms, the marching and the discipline. And I'm going to back that up with this is also true as the Hitler Youth offered them stability and strength, something that was lacking during the Great Depression. They liked the structure and the uniform made them feel proud again, as well as feeling part of something wonderful. They even got a dagger inscribed with a note from a key Nazi which meant the world to the boys. Bringing in again some more knowledge. They also like the appeal of the army and fighting for their country and contributing, especially the idea that their country will one day be the best again, and it all relies on them. Finally, interpretation 1 says, so a third quote, other young people liked the music that was a frequent part of the cultural activities. I'm going to basically end this paragraph by supporting that, again highlighting that many felt part of something bigger and the growing pride in their nation, which shows the view of interpretation 1 to be correct, that attitudes were positive towards the Hitler Youth. So hopefully you can see that there's not a huge amount of knowledge in there. There's enough though, because we've used the quotes from the interpretation. We've got 2 lovely paragraphs, and now we just need to draw this to a head and conclude. And this is now in the conclusion where you argue your point. So I am starting off because I believe I agree with interpretation 2. So I'm going to say, in conclusion, I can see why both interpretations could be true about attitudes towards the Hitler Youth, but I agree much more with the interpretation 2. I maintain that if it was so good, they wouldn't have had to make it compulsory. Also, the bullying was terrible, and the strictness is something that most young people will most certainly have hated. There will always be some young people who enjoy leadership and military drills and getting to be a bully, but most wouldn't and would rather have just had fun with their friends. I feel that's a fair thing for me to say in my argument that most kids wouldn't like being bullied. I also find the tone of interpretation 2 slightly more empathetic, using phrases like barely older than they were and began to kick against the restrictions. This makes the interpretation more understandable and relatable to the reader. I also think it's quite broad in offering specific reasons for why it became more negative, talking about the strictness, discipline, preparation for war, and it becoming compulsory. I find the language of interpretation 1 a bit too exaggerated and emotional, using words like attracted by, exciting, and interesting. Also slightly hyperbolic, saying that there was a great comradeship, not really allowing for the suggestion that not everyone had the great comradeship. So again, not perfect, but hopefully you can see how I'm ticking all sorts of boxes in this 20 marker. And the technique of it, if nothing else comes across to you in this video, is really, really, really clear. All right, so thank you for getting this far. Just a little reminder that all of our lessons are on our website, stchistory.com. This is essentially now after the feedback bit. If you watch this in the summer when you're getting ready for your paper 3, it becomes a reminder of a walkthrough how to do paper 3. And remember to check the links below for the detailed revision on the topics in this paper, Hitler Youth and Rise of Hitler. If you know those two things, I'm pretty confident that whatever they throw at us in the summer, we'll be absolutely fine with. So once again, thank you very much. Hopefully you found this useful. Any feedback, let us know. If you've got any questions, also let us know. All right, thank you very much, and we will see you for the next video real soon. Goodbye.